The story begins in the year 1914. A small island with no city, no crowds, just a lighthouse and a mystery buried deep beneath the ocean. The film opens with a ship cutting through the South Atlantic Ocean, heading toward its destination. On board was a weather officer named David. They were heading toward an island hidden in the deepest parts of the Atlantic Ocean. The government had sent David there to observe the island's changing weather patterns. David was supposed to stay for nearly a year to collect data, study the strange weather shifts, and then return. Captain Axel was taking David to the island on his ship, along with a year's worth of food and all necessary supplies. After a long journey, they finally reached the island. They came ashore by boat, bringing their essential gear with them. The island had a lighthouse and a small house where David was supposed to live, since a previous weather officer had already been stationed there. But that officer's term was over. From today, David was the island's new weather officer, and the previous one, Robert, was supposed to be heading home on Captain Axel's ship. But when they entered the house, they were stunned. There was no sign of any human being. The furniture inside was scattered. Everything was turned upside down. Maybe someone could be in the lighthouse. Without wasting a moment, the captain and David headed toward the lighthouse, and what they saw there was deeply unsettling. The entire lighthouse was surrounded by sharp wooden spikes, as if someone had deliberately sealed it shut so no one could get inside. The captain and David knocked on the gate several times, but got no response. Finally, they shoved the gate open and forced their way in. At the very top of the lighthouse, they found a man named Gruner lying down. When they asked him about the old weather officer, his answer was chillingly casual. He died. Some terrible illness. When the captain asked about the body, his reply was even stranger. Maybe someone killed him. David and the captain were both shaken. They figured Gruner's mental state wasn't right, but until they found out what happened to the old officer, there was nothing they could do. The captain told David he could still come back with them if he wanted, but David knew if he could deliver an accurate weather report to the government, he'd earn serious money, and he needed the money, so he decided to stay. The captain gave him a gun for self-defense. Maybe this place wasn't as safe as it looked. After the captain left, David cleaned up the house and made it livable. Inside a locker in the room, he found a diary belonging to the previous officer. That officer had set foot on this island back in 1913. The diary was full of details about the island, but not everything was clear. Some things were left incomplete. David read every line carefully. There were also sketches of strange creatures drawn in the diary. Just then, someone knocked at the door. He figured it was probably Gruner. David called out his name but got no answer. Lamp in hand, as David moved forward, strange sounds began echoing in his ears, and then he saw it. From beneath the gate, something was trying to reach inside, something that was not a human hand. David's heart filled with terror. He bolted toward the basement and hid inside. Within moments, the mysterious creature had broken into the house. It was sneaking around hunting for David. Through a tiny crack in the basement wall, the creature's horrifying eyes locked onto him. David grabbed a knife, and the moment those eyes appeared in front of the crack, he drove the blade in with full force. The creature shrieked and fled, but it could return at any time. David bolted the basement gate shut, tied it tight with rope, and spent the entire night awake, consumed by fear. The next morning, when David stepped outside, he noticed marks in the sand, footprints, but not like any human footprint. It was crystal clear. This was no human. The tracks led straight toward the ocean and stopped there. Now David understood everything. Why Gruner had surrounded the lighthouse with wooden spikes. It was because of that creature. And now David knew this house was not safe for him at all. That thing might come back tonight. Terrified, David sprinted toward the lighthouse, screaming at Gruner to open the gate and let him in. But Gruner refused and told him he should have left with the ship. Discouraged, David turned back, but now he had to make his home secure. He boarded up every single window with wooden planks, built a perimeter of sharp wooden spikes all around, and outside the gate he placed old papers and books. Then he doused them in oil so that if the creature returned, he could drive it away with fire. But there was one thing David still didn't know, and he was about to find out tonight. By luck, he discovered an old box inside the house. Inside it was a gun and plenty of bullets. It gave him a little courage, but the fear was still very much alive. As the sun began to set and darkness crept across the island, David sat silently in a corner of the house, gun in hand. His breathing was quick. Then a strange sound broke the silence. And when David stepped toward the window, it felt like the ground had been pulled right out from under him. Not just one, several of those same horrifying creatures were rising out of the water, and they were all moving toward his house. Moments later, they began trying to break down the gate. David immediately started firing. Some creatures fell, but the rest grew even more violent. They were now trying to force their way inside. As their numbers grew, David didn't waste a second. He set fire to the papers and old books stacked outside the gate. The creatures, spooked by the flames, retreated back into the ocean. But now that same fire had reached David's house. The house was on fire, and because the entire structure was built of wood, the flames spread like lightning. David quickly wrapped himself in a sheet, shielded himself, broke through the gate, and fled toward the lighthouse, hiding behind a large rock nearby. His right hand had been badly burned. By luck, rain began to fall at that moment. The fire slowly began to die down. But even after a full night of rain, by morning David couldn't save his house. The entire thing had burned down, reduced nearly to ash. Now, if David wanted to survive, he had to find shelter in the lighthouse. He picked up his rifle and hid among the rocks near the lighthouse. When Gruner came outside to fetch water, David followed close behind. His plan was to hold him at gunpoint and force his way into the lighthouse. But just as David aimed the gun at him, a strange creature that had been right beside Gruner lunged at him. It was Gruner's guardian. Gruner immediately stopped David and said, "This is my pet." David held his fire but set one condition. If he wanted to survive, David had to be allowed to live in the lighthouse. Gruner slowly agreed. Before evening fell, both of them took what food remained and returned to the lighthouse. The next morning, the creature was quietly licking David's hand while he slept soundly, and within a short while, his hand had healed significantly. At the top of the lighthouse, David noticed Gruner counting the bullets from the gun, while the creature was helping him in its own way. That meant this animal wasn't violent. David now wanted to know more about it from Gruner, and then bring all of this to the world's attention, because this felt like nothing short of magic. But how had that strange female creature become his pet? In truth, Gruner had once saved her life. She had accidentally gotten tangled in his fishing net. She was small back then, and from that day on, she stayed by Gruner's side. She started obeying his every command. But Gruner was a volatile man, and he never treated that creature with any humanity. He maintained regular physical relations with her. Once, the creature attacked Gruner, and in return, Gruner punished her, a punishment that left her conditioned to see herself as his servant. And perhaps that's why every night those creatures came out of the ocean to take her back. But they couldn't attack during daylight. Regardless, David no longer wanted to be here. He was done with this place. Evening was approaching. Gruner told him to grab the gun and get ready, because those creatures could strike at any moment. They prepared to turn on the lighthouse light, and within moments, a massive group of creatures emerged from the ocean. They were advancing straight toward the lighthouse. Gruner kept firing at them continuously, but David was completely paralyzed with fear. He started backing away toward the inside of the lighthouse. No matter how many times Gruner urged him to fight, David just sat frozen in a corner, and then passed out entirely. Gruner fought on alone. The next morning, Gruner shook him awake in anger and told him if he wanted to stay in this lighthouse, he had to do as Gruner said. Fetch water every day, handle the small and large tasks of the lighthouse, and stand guard duty at night. But there was one thing David could never stomach: watching Gruner physically torture that female creature in new and different ways, every single day. Night fell. Both prepared for guard duty again, and once more those creatures rose from the ocean. But this time, David wasn't afraid. He opened fire. But today, Gruner did nothing. He locked the lighthouse gate from inside, leaving David alone outside. David screamed for help, but Gruner didn't come. Fighting through that night alone, David made it to morning. In the morning, Gruner saw David sitting outside the lighthouse gate, soaked in blood. But he had learned. He now knew how to fight these creatures. The fear inside him was gone. Time passed this way, fighting creatures at night and managing the lighthouse for Gruner during the day. This island had become like a locked cage for him. He was always thinking about when he could leave this place, when he could be free. Slow, wet, David developed a strange kind of friendship with the female creature. He even gave her a name, Anarius. And then one day they noticed the creature's attacks were gradually decreasing. David thought maybe during winter they migrated somewhere else, like whales do, or maybe they'd realized fighting these two wasn't getting them anywhere. But Gruner told him flat out, no, they'll attack again. They're reproducing right now. Their numbers are growing. A few more days passed just like that. One night after dinner, Gruner and David started playing chess to pass the time. And this is where Gruner made a massive mistake. Both of them got so absorbed in the game that they completely forgot to turn on the lighthouse lights. Taking advantage of the darkness, the creatures launched an attack. David saw they had bred. There were even more of them now. Barely managing to escape, both made it to the top of the lighthouse. But during the chaos, Gruner suffered a deep wound to his leg. The creatures were trying to break into the lighthouse, and David and Gruner couldn't see any way out. They had given up hope, but luckily, morning arrived. As the sun slowly rose, the creatures abandoned the lighthouse and retreated back into the ocean. Anarius tried to help heal Gruner's wounds, but by now David understood. They could not win this fight against the creatures. The bullets were running dangerously low. They didn't have enough food to hold out much longer either. The next day, luckily, while David was wandering near the lighthouse, he spotted a ship at sea. He quickly grabbed a flare gun from inside and ran to signal it. But Gruner stopped him. He didn't want David to leave. At that very moment, Anarius attacked Gruner. She was trying to protect David from him. Gruner refused to let anyone leave this island. Slowly, the ship vanished into the ocean before David's eyes. Now, there was nothing he could do. One day, David gifted Anarius a small toy boat he had carved from whale bones. Maybe it would lift her spirits a little. But when Anarius saw that boat, she led David to a hidden corner of the island, where a real boat was actually stored. When David asked Gruner about it, he admitted he'd known about the boat in that part of the island all along. A few months earlier, an arms smuggling ship carrying a large amount of explosives had sunk near this very island due to a storm at sea. Some survivors had made it to the island by boat, but none of them survived until morning. They all fell prey to the creatures. The moment David heard all this, an idea formed in his mind. They had something resembling a diving suit. If one of them put it on and dived into that part of the ocean, they might find bullets or dynamite, something that would make fighting those monsters far easier. But Gruner flatly refused. A few more days passed this way. A deep bond had been forming between David and Anarius. David had grown genuinely fond of her. Gruner saw all of this quietly from a distance. And for the very first time, the thought crossed his mind that maybe he should help David. But Gruner's real motive was something else entirely. He wanted David to dive down and retrieve the dynamite boxes resting on the ocean floor, and then leave David stranded down there alone so the creatures would kill him. That way, the dynamite would be his, and Anarius would once again be his slave. Both made their way to the spa. David put on the diving suit and descended beneath the ocean's surface. The ship was completely destroyed, but fortunately, they found several boxes of dynamite. Just then, the creatures appeared right in front of him. David panicked and fell. The iron diving suit was so heavy he couldn't even move. He couldn't signal Gruner above either. Gruner assumed the creatures had killed David, but in reality, it was just two small children down there. David built up pressure underwater and abandoned the diving suit right there. He swam to the surface on his own. They found some old boxes containing dynamite. They laid the dynamite in 2 layers around the lighthouse so that when the next attack came, they could finish the monsters in one single blow. A few months passed and snow began to fall. But once again, the creatures had disappeared. The attacks had stopped. Their main job now was running the lighthouse and keeping watch as always. Gruner's patience had completely snapped. Maybe Anarius had tipped the monsters off about the dynamite plan, which was why they weren't attacking anymore. Gruner flew into a rage and started beating Anarius, but David stepped in and stopped him. Finally, the two of them devised a new plan to leave the lighthouse's main gate open so that as soon as the creatures approached, they could blow them up with the dynamite. Moments later, the creatures began emerging from the ocean. They moved straight for the main gate, and as they entered, they attacked David. David stood his ground and fought back. As the creatures closed in on the lighthouse, Gruner pulled the dynamite lever, but nothing happened. David had disconnected the wiring and forgotten to reconnect it. David immediately sprinted upstairs and started reconnecting the dynamite wire, while the creatures were climbing the lighthouse below, with only Gruner holding them back, alone. The moment the connection was complete, David blew the first layer. Several creatures were obliterated in the blast, but a large number of monsters were still ready to attack the lighthouse. Because of this, Gruner set off the second layer too. Both were knocked unconscious in the devastating explosion. The next morning, when both came to, Inarius was nowhere to be found. Dead creatures were scattered everywhere. Gruner was finishing off those that were still alive but wounded. Then David's eyes landed on a necklace hanging from one of the creature's necks, and in that moment, David realized his greatest mistake. The creatures they had always assumed were violent. They were just like humans, too. They simply couldn't speak. Maybe their attacks on the lighthouse had a reason behind them. But for Gruner, none of this mattered. David hadn't yet understood how much damage they had caused. The next day, David saw small creature children in the ocean, all those who had lost their families. David arranged stones in a round circle and placed the little toy boat in the center, hoping Inarius would come back. But no matter how long he waited, Inarius never returned. One morning, David found Gruner unconscious with some old items scattered around him. Among them was an old photograph. And the moment David looked at it, he was stunned. The girl whose photo he'd seen in Gruner's diary on the very first day, she was his wife. And his real name was Robert. But he had changed his name because he no longer wanted to leave this island. Ever. The next evening, when David went to the ocean shore, he noticed the little boat he had placed in the circle was gone. But in that same spot, he saw a small creature child holding that very boat in its hands. David tossed his torch into the center of the circle to show that his intentions weren't to fight. Moments later, Inarius emerged from the ocean waves, and behind her the entire group of creatures also rose from the sea. But this time, no one attacked David, because they too wanted peace. Their only intention had been to find a safe place for their children, something every living creature does. The sudden arrival of humans on their island hadn't sat well with them. That's why they attacked every night. But who was going to explain this to Gruner? He still considered himself the king of this island. Gruner came out of the lighthouse, gun in hand. David tried to reason with him. These creatures don't want to fight. They want peace. But Gruner wouldn't listen to anyone. He screamed at Inarius to get back inside. But this was the first time Inarius refused to listen to him. Gruner began to feel weak inside, because now nobody was obeying him. In a rage, he stepped toward the lighthouse. David thought maybe Gruner had finally understood that every creature wants freedom, that no one wants to live as someone else's slave. But Gruner was not a reasonable man. The moment he reached the lighthouse, he fired a flare from the signal gun, and it flew directly into a small creature child. The child died instantly. All the creatures fled in terror, and Inarius lost every bit of trust she had ever placed in David. Burning with fury, David sprinted toward the lighthouse and confronted Gruner. He got into a fight with him. Why did you do this? These people just wanted peace. But Gruner had become so violent that he decided to kill David. Axe in hand, just as he was about to strike, David called out his real name, Robert. Gruner froze instantly. The truth was, Robert had never been this kind of man. After arriving on this island, his mental state had nearly broken down completely. And now Gruner understood his mistake, so he surrendered himself to the creatures, and within moments they killed him. David locked himself inside the lighthouse. Time continued to pass, and a year later, a government official arrived at the island, along with a new weather officer. But the official assumed David was Gruner, and David didn't bother correcting that misunderstanding. He quietly walked out to the balcony and stood there in silence, saying nothing. Because now he too had no desire to leave this island. Just like Gruner, meanwhile, Inarius was happy with her family. They no longer had to fear anyone like Gruner. Now they could live freely, on the island and in the ocean alike.